What would you do if the one person who finally made you feel alive showed up 5 years too late? Right after grief had already turned you into a ghost? Nathan Reed built half of Willow Creek with his bare hands. Barns, bridges, homes for other people's families. But the one thing he could never build again was the courage to love someone. Then Grace Harper walked into town, and everything he'd spent 5 years nailing shut started to crack open. This is a story about what grief does to a man, and what one stubborn woman decided to do about it. Stay until the very end, because this story doesn't go where you think it's going. And if you're new here, subscribe right now and become part of our family. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The first thing most people noticed about Nathan Reed was his hands. They were not the hands of a young man, though Nathan was only 31. They were wide and cracked at the knuckles, permanently stained with walnut oil and sawdust that never seemed to fully wash out no matter how hard he scrubbed. The kind of hands that had been put to work early and never really stopped. Old Hector Grimes, who ran the feed store on Main Street, used to tell people that Nathan's hands looked like they belonged to a man who had been building things since before he could walk. And that wasn't entirely wrong. Nathan had grown up in Willow Creek, Montana territory, the son of a carpenter and the grandson of a carpenter before that. He had learned to swing a hammer at age 6, to read wood grain at 8, and to cut a proper dovetail joint by the time he was 12. By 20, he was already being hired for the kinds of jobs that the older craftsmen in the valley quietly admitted were beyond them. Complex roof structures, load-bearing frames designed to survive the brutal Montana winters, furniture so carefully fitted together that not a single nail was needed to hold it. People trusted Nathan Reed with their most important things, their homes, their barns, the church hall roof that had been leaking for a decade, the schoolhouse floor that buckled every spring when the ground thawed. What they did not know, what most of them had simply stopped thinking about, the way small towns eventually stopped thinking about the quiet griefs of their neighbors, was that Nathan had not always been this still. There had been a time, not so long ago really, when Nathan Reed laughed easily, when he had opinions about things other than wood and weather, when he stayed at the harvest fair until the music stopped instead of leaving an hour after it started, nodding to people without quite meeting their eyes. That was before Clara. Clara Whitfield had grown up on the farm 2 miles east of the Reed property, close enough that as children they had found each other almost by accident, 2 kids exploring the same creek on the same summer afternoon when Nathan was 9 and Clara was 8. She had been chasing a frog. He had been trying to dam a section of the water with flat stones. They had argued about whether his dam would ruin the frog's territory, and somehow that argument had turned into a friendship that lasted the next 10 years without either of them quite deciding to start it. By the time they were 17, it had turned into something else. Nathan was not a man who talked about love easily, not even then. He was better at doing things than saying them. When Clara mentioned once that she had always wanted a garden with no practical purpose, just flowers, just color, just beauty for its own sake, Nathan spent 3 weekends building her raised planting beds from cedar so the soil would stay warm longer into autumn. He said nothing about why he did it. Clara said nothing either, but she planted the beds with every wildflower seed she could find, and Nathan showed up on Sunday mornings to help her water them before anyone else in either family was awake. That was how it was between them. Quiet. Certain. The kind of thing that doesn't need to announce itself. They had planned to marry in the spring of 1880. Nathan had already started building their home, a modest house on a parcel of land he had purchased from the Willow Creek Bank with 4 years of careful savings. He framed the walls, cut the window casings, fit the floorboards tongue and groove so tight you couldn't slide a piece of paper between them. Clara had sketched what the kitchen should look like. She had picked out where the garden would go, measured off from the porch by how many steps she wanted to walk to reach her flowers in the morning. He also built her a hope chest. It took him the better part of 3 weeks, working evenings after his regular jobs were done. He used the best piece of black walnut he had ever cut, dense-grained, nearly black in the lamplight, with a natural figure in the wood that looked almost like water moving. He fit it with cedar lining for fragrance and soft preservation, carved the exterior with a pattern of intertwined vines that he never told anyone he had designed to look like the creek where they had met. He polished it until it seemed to glow from the inside. He never gave it to her. The fever came in December of 1879. It moved through Willow Creek the way those things moved then. Quickly, without warning, without preference for who it took and who it left behind. 3 children. Old Margaret Paulson from the south end of town, a ranch hand from the Teller property who nobody had ever properly learned the name of, and Clara Whitfield. 20 years old, 2 months before her wedding. Nathan was with her at the end. He did not talk about it afterward, not with his father, not with Clara's family, not with anyone. He sat with her through the last night, and when it was over he walked home in the early morning dark and went to his workshop and sat down on the floor and did not move for a long time. Later, weeks later, when people started coming back around, bringing food and saying careful words, Nathan went back to work. He finished other people's projects. He took new jobs. He was polite and capable and showed up when he said he would, which was more than some men managed even without grief. But the house he had been building for himself and Clara, he stopped. He covered the hope chest with a piece of old canvas and put it in the corner of his workshop where the light didn't reach well, and he did not look at it again. 5 years passed. Nathan turned 26, then 27, then 31. He became exactly what Willow Creek needed him to be: reliable, skilled, always available, never asking for much. His reputation spread into the neighboring valleys. He was hired for bigger and bigger jobs. He ate supper alone most nights, or occasionally with his father when the old man's joints allowed him to make the walk across town. He attended church on Sundays without particular feeling. He went to the harvest fair each year for exactly 1 hour, because people noticed if you didn't show up at all. He dated nobody. He entertained no intentions from anyone, and there had been a few. Millicent Hale had made her interest fairly clear for the better part of 2 years before she finally gave up and married the postmaster's nephew from Butte. Nathan had been polite about it, the way he was polite about everything, which was to say he was kind without being warm and present without being available. His workshop became the place he spent more time than anywhere else. He was most comfortable there, surrounded by the smell of cut wood and linseed oil, with a clear task in front of him and his hands doing what they knew how to do. He did not have to feel anything in particular when he was working. That was the point. He kept the hope chest in the corner. He did not think about it, or so he told himself. He arranged his tools so that his back was to it when he worked at his bench. This was the man that Grace Harper arrived to find. She came on a Tuesday in late August of 1885, on the same stage that brought the mail and 3 bolts of fabric she had ordered from a supplier in Helena. Nathan did not see her arrive. He was in the middle of replacing a load-bearing beam in the back of Hector Grimes's feed store, a job that required his full attention because the old beam had been compromised by moisture and the ceiling above it was doing something that buildings should not do. He heard about her the way he heard about most things in Willow Creek, indirectly, through pieces of other people's conversations. "Woman came in on the stage," Hector mentioned, not looking up from his ledger. "Young, brought a sewing machine. She's talking about opening a shop." Nathan said nothing. He tested the new beam with his shoulder, found it solid, and started checking the secondary joists. "Pretty thing," Hector added, with the tone of a man leaving information on a counter to see if someone picks it up. Nathan did not pick it up. "You've got moisture getting into the exterior wall behind the shelf. You want me to check it, or leave it?" Hector let the subject go. Nathan met Grace Harper for the first time 4 days later, and it was not a notable meeting by any standard he would have applied at the time. She had rented the former hat shop space on the east end of Main Street, a narrow storefront with large windows that faced south and flooded with afternoon light, which was exactly what a seamstress needed. She had painted the door herself, a color that was either green or gray depending on the light, and hung a small sign that said Harper Seamstress and alterations in careful block letters. Nathan was walking past with a length of lumber on his shoulder when she came out the front door too quickly and nearly walked into the end of it. He stopped. She stopped. She was not as young as Hector had implied. Mid-20s, he guessed, with the dark hair pulled back practically, and an expression that suggested she was a person who usually moved faster than she had time for. "Sorry," she said immediately, stepping sideways. My fault, Nathan said, which was not strictly true, but was what you said. She looked at the lumber with the kind of directness that slightly surprised him. That's white oak. You don't see that much out here. Nathan adjusted the beam on his shoulder. Not often. It's beautiful grain. She wasn't being flattering. She said it the way a person says a true thing. Nathan looked at her for a moment. You know lumber? My father was a builder. She said it without sentimentality, as a fact. What are you using it for? Shelving. For the new library the town council approved. She nodded, glancing at it once more. The grain on that piece is going to show nicely, if you orient it right. Then she went back inside, and Nathan continued down the street. He did not think about it particularly. But that evening in his workshop, he found himself orienting the white oak board to better show the grain, turning it 3 different ways before he settled on one. He told himself it was because it was good practice. He did not examine that thought very closely. The second time was 2 weeks later. Grace Harper appeared at his workshop door on a Wednesday afternoon with the expression of someone who had been deciding whether to knock for a few minutes before finally doing it. Mr. Reed, I was told you're the person to ask about carpentry work. I am, he said. I've got a shelf bracket that's pulling out of the wall. The previous tenant must have anchored it into plaster without finding a stud. It's holding my heaviest fabric bolts, and I'm worried it'll come down. Nathan pulled on his jacket. I'll look at it. It took him 11 minutes to fix. He pulled the old bracket, found the stud with 3 taps of his knuckle against the wall, a skill so automatic he barely registered doing it, drilled proper pilot holes, and reset the bracket with screws long enough to hold twice the weight she'd ever put on it. What do I owe you? Grace asked, watching him work with the same attentive quality he'd noticed the first time. She wasn't chattering to fill silence. She was actually watching how he did it. Nothing. It's 20 minutes of work. I pay for work done, she said. There was no argument in her voice, just a statement of how she operated. He named a fair price. She paid it without negotiation, which he respected. He was halfway to the door when she said, The window frame on the east side is warped. I haven't asked about it because I wasn't sure if it was my problem or the landlord's, but it's letting cold air in. He looked at it. The frame had been there a long time. The wood had twisted slightly, which happened with older buildings that hadn't been maintained properly. I can fix it, he said. Next week? Thursday. He came back Thursday. He fixed the window frame. This time when she offered coffee while he worked, he said yes, which surprised him slightly even as he said it. He couldn't remember the last time he had accepted that kind of small hospitality from someone he barely knew. The coffee was stronger than he expected. He drank it standing, looking out the now properly sealed window at Main Street while she went back to her work at the sewing machine. Neither of them said much. It was not an uncomfortable silence. When he left, he realized he had stayed 40 minutes longer than the job required. He told himself it was because the frame had been more involved than he anticipated. It was not, particularly. By October, Grace Harper had found 4 more things in her shop that needed fixing. The back door latch, a floorboard near the fitting area that creaked badly enough to make customers nervous, a section of baseboard that had separated from the wall, a ceiling beam that she was not sure about and wanted looked at just to be certain. Nathan fixed all of them. He also started to notice, with the careful attention he usually reserved for wood grain and load calculations, that Grace was not asking him back because she was helpless with maintenance. She had, on at least 2 occasions, clearly attempted to fix something herself before calling him. He could see her work, the small nail holes in the wrong place, the marks where she'd tried to find the stud and missed. She was not incompetent. She simply had limits, and she knew where they were, which was more self-knowledge than most people demonstrated. He also noticed that she asked questions that had nothing to do with carpentry, not personal questions, nothing that crossed a line, but she would ask about a building he had worked on, or about the history of a particular technique, or once, unprompted, while he was reseating the baseboard, about whether he'd always wanted to be a carpenter, or whether it had just happened to him. He had been about to give a short answer, the kind of answer he gave to most questions about himself. Instead, he said, Both, I think. I grew up in it, but there was a point when I could have gone a different direction, and I chose to stay. What would the different direction have been? He considered that. Architecture. There was a man came through when I was 17 working on a project over in Great Falls. He saw some drawings I'd done and said I had a feel for it. Said if I went to study it properly, I could do real work. Big work. Grace looked up from the seam she was pinning. Why didn't you? I didn't want to leave, Nathan said. Then, because that was not quite the whole truth, I didn't want to leave at that particular time. Grace was quiet for a moment, as if she understood that at that particular time was carrying more weight than the words suggested. She didn't push it. That was the moment, though Nathan did not fully recognize it until much later, when something began to shift inside the careful, sealed structure he had spent 5 years constructing around himself. It was small, like the first hairline crack in a wall that looks solid, the kind you don't notice until the day you lean against it and realize it won't hold the way it used to. He packed up his tools. He said goodnight. He walked home through the October dark, which had started coming earlier now, the way it always did in Montana when September turned the corner. He did not sleep well. In the morning, he went to his workshop and stood for a long moment looking at the canvas-covered shape in the corner. He did not lift the canvas. But for the first time in 5 years, he did not arrange his tools so that his back was turned to it. The thing about cracks is that they don't wait for you to be ready. Nathan went back to his regular work after that October evening. A roof repair out on the Callaway Ranch, new framing for the expanded storage room behind the post office, a commission for 6 dining chairs from the Whitmore family who had more money than taste but paid promptly. He moved through his days the way he always had, early to rise, tools in hand before the town was fully awake, lunch eaten standing at his bench, evenings alone with whatever project was half finished on the work table. But something had changed in the quality of the silence. Before Grace Harper arrived in Willow Creek, the quiet of Nathan's workshop had felt complete, self-contained, like a room with no windows. Not oppressive if you'd grown up in it, simply the condition of things. Now the quiet had a different texture. It was the silence of a man who had recently remembered that other kinds of rooms existed. He told himself this was nothing. He was good at telling himself things were nothing. It worked for about 3 weeks. Then the first snow came, early, the way Montana snow sometimes did, dropping 6 inches overnight in the second week of November. And Nathan was coming back from the Callaway property in the gray late afternoon when he saw Grace Harper standing outside her shop trying to clear the snow off her front step with what was clearly a broom designed for indoor floors. The bristles were already ruined. She was attacking the snow with the kind of focused frustration of a person who had not yet accepted that the wrong tool for a job was still the wrong tool no matter how much effort you applied to it. Nathan stopped. He watched this for a moment. "That's a house broom," he said. Grace looked up. A piece of her hair had come loose from its pin and was stuck to her cheek from the cold. She looked at the broom, then back at him. "I'm aware of that. You need a snow shovel. I also need a team of horses and a larger shop, but I'm working with what I have." He leaned his toolbox against the building next door and held out his hand. She looked at him for a second, then handed over the ruined broom. He made 2 passes with it, angled, using the edge rather than the flat, the way you could clear light snow with almost anything if you knew the motion, and got the step passable in under a minute. "That's a technique," Grace said with genuine curiosity. "You're fighting it. Work with the weight of the snow, not against it." "I've never lived somewhere with this much of it." "Where are you from?" "Kansas originally, then 2 years in St. Louis." She took the broom back, studied the angle he'd demonstrated, tried it on the remaining patch. It worked better. "My father always handled the snow." "Did he teach you the carpentry?" She glanced up at that, and he realized immediately that it had come out wrong. Too personal, too direct, referencing something from a conversation several weeks prior that implied he had been carrying it with him, which he had, but he had not intended to show that. Grace, however, did not make anything of it. "He did," she said simply. "He thought it was important that I understand how things were built. Not to build them myself necessarily, but so nobody could cheat me or talk over my head about my own house." She paused. "He was practical that way." "Was," Nathan said, catching the tense. "He died 4 years ago. Heart." "I'm sorry." She nodded in the way people nod when they've had enough time with a grief that it no longer needs elaboration. Not healed, people didn't say that and mean it, but settled, incorporated. Nathan picked up his toolbox. "Mr. Reed," Grace said. He stopped. "Would you like supper? I've got a pot of something on the stove. It's nothing particular, just what I put together. But it's hot, and you've been out in the cold all day by the look of you." Nathan opened his mouth to say no. He had the word ready. He said no to these kinds of things automatically, the way you develop reflexes for things that have caused you pain before. "All right," he said instead. He surprised himself enough that he almost took it back. He didn't. The space behind Grace's shop was small, a narrow room she used as combined kitchen, storage, and sitting area, with a wood stove in the corner that she clearly kept burning through working hours because it was the warmest room Nathan had been in all week. A work table was pushed against one wall, covered in fabric samples and paper patterns held down by a coffee cup, a spool of thread, and what appeared to be a small river stone that served no obvious purpose. The supper was bean soup with salt pork, thick enough to be close to stew, with a heel of bread on the side. It was the most straightforward meal Nathan had eaten in years. Most of the food he cooked for himself was simpler still, whatever came together quickly so he could get back to the workshop. But there was something about eating a proper meal at an actual table with another person that he had forgotten was different from eating alone. They talked, not about anything Nathan would have been able to report as significant afterward. Grace told him about the difficulties of establishing a new business in a town where people already had their arrangements. The women who did alterations, the woman who made hats, the existing networks of who owed whom a favor and who bought from whom out of loyalty rather than quality. She had been navigating it carefully, slowly building trust. "You're patient about it," Nathan observed. "I'm stubborn about it," she corrected, without heat. "Patience implies I'm comfortable waiting. I'm not. I just know that pushing too hard makes people dig in, so I do good work and wait for them to figure it out." "Has it been working?" "Mrs. Calloway came in last week, left with 3 alterations and a commission for a winter dress." A pause. "She talked the whole time, told me about everybody in the valley." Nathan's mouth moved slightly. "She does that." "She mentioned you." He looked up from his bowl. Grace was not smiling exactly, but there was something careful in the way she was watching him. "She said you'd been a different person before the girl you were going to marry died. That the whole town had been waiting 5 years for you to come back to yourself, and that they'd mostly given up." She said it directly, without cruelty. Just the fact of it, laid on the table the same way she'd laid the bread. The room was quiet for a moment. The wood stove made its small sounds. "Mrs. Calloway," Nathan said finally, "doesn't have a great deal of difficulty saying things." "No," Grace agreed. "Most of what she says is accurate." "I know. She told me about Clara." A pause. "You don't have to talk about it." "I'm not going to," Nathan said. "That's fine." And that was the end of it, which was either the most considerate thing anyone had done with the subject in 5 years, or the thing Nathan least knew how to handle. He couldn't decide which. He finished his soup. Grace refilled his cup of coffee without asking. Outside, the snow had started again, visible through the small window as slow-falling dark shapes in the last of the evening light. He stayed another hour. Walking home through the fresh snow, Nathan was aware of a feeling he could not immediately name. Not happiness, exactly. Not the sharp-edged feeling from earlier in the fall when he'd noticed the crack forming. Something quieter. The feeling of having been, for a short time, in a room where he was neither invisible nor handled carefully. He had not realized until that evening how exhausting it was to always be handled carefully. November became December. The jobs slowed the way they always did when the cold settled in properly. Nobody wanted major construction in a Montana winter, and the smaller repair work could wait or could be done by the owners themselves if the cost was a concern. Nathan took the slower season to work on the commissioned furniture, to do the detailed joinery and finishing work that required time rather than muscle. He found himself in Grace's shop more than the repair jobs strictly accounted for. He fixed the things she identified, but he also started arriving with wood he had milled for the shelving she mentioned needing, or stopping by to check that the window frame he'd repaired in October was still holding against the cold. Grace never commented on these additional appearances. She simply put coffee on and continued whatever she was working on, and they existed in the same space with a comfort that neither of them examined too closely. He learned things about her in pieces, the way you learn the details of a building by working on it rather than by looking at the blueprint. She had left St. Louis because she had been working in a large dress shop for 2 years, skilled enough that she was doing the work of the senior seamstresses without the title or the pay. And when she asked about it directly, her employer, a man, which mattered, had said that she needed more experience before she could be trusted with that kind of responsibility. She had calculated that she had enough saved to try something on her own. She had looked at several towns. Willow Creek had a gap. "Weren't you scared?" Nathan asked, on a December afternoon when the wind was loud enough against the windows that they'd both raised their voices slightly. He was planing a piece of wood for a new display shelf, working at the small clear area of her work table she'd started leaving available when he came by. "Of course I was scared," Grace said, not looking up from the hem she was finishing. "I was terrified. I spent the whole stage ride here going over every reason it could go wrong." "But you came anyway." "Being scared doesn't mean it's the wrong thing to do. It usually just means it matters." Nathan ran the plane along the wood grain, the curl of shaving peeled away in a clean ribbon. "Most people would have stayed where they were." "Most people do," Grace said. "That's not a criticism. It's just how things are." He thought about that for a while without saying anything. Grace looked up and caught him at it. That thing she seemed to notice, the moments when something landed in him that he needed to work through quietly. She had a gift for not interrupting those moments, which was rare. Most people filled silence with words. Grace seemed to understand that some thoughts needed space. "What?" she said, because she could also tell when the quiet had run its course. "Nothing," Nathan said. Then, because that was not honest, "I stayed where I was." Grace held his gaze for a moment. "I know." Then she went back to her hemming, not closing the conversation, so just letting it be what it was. The question of what exactly Nathan was feeling did not become undeniable until December the 22nd, which was a Wednesday, 3 days before Christmas, when he arrived at Grace's shop in the mid-morning to deliver the finished display shelf and found her in conversation with James Whitmore, youngest of the Whitmore sons, 24 years old, good-looking in the way of young men who have not yet had enough difficulty to make them interesting, and currently leaning against Grace's front counter with the particular posture of a man who has decided to be charming. Nathan heard the laughter through the door before he opened it. Grace's laugh, which he had heard only a few times and which had a quality of being slightly reluctant, like she found the thing funny before she wanted to. He opened the door, shelf under one arm. James Whitmore turned. He had the easy smile of someone who had never had to work very hard at being liked. "Reed, didn't know you were doing work in here." "Ongoing," Nathan said. "Nathan, you can just set it against the wall there," Grace said, gesturing, and her voice was the same as always. Not warmer toward James Whitmore, not different in any particular way, but Nathan found himself listening for difference with an attention he had not known he was capable of. He set the shelf against the wall. He checked the fit of the bracket he'd installed the week before. He found a small distraction in checking the level of the existing shelving along the east wall, which he had already checked twice and did not need to check again. James Whitmore stayed another 10 minutes before leaving, touching his hat to Grace in a way that managed to be both polite and pointed. Nathan did not say anything for a moment after the door closed. "He comes in a lot?" he asked, and then immediately regretted the question because of the way it sounded. Grace looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "He's come in twice. His mother sent him about alterations on a coat." A pause. "Is that a concern of yours?" The question was direct enough that Nathan did not have a deflection ready. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Okay," Grace said. Neither of them believed the answer. Both of them let it stand anyway, because there are questions that are asked not to be answered honestly, but to be acknowledged. And Nathan had just acknowledged that there was something there that James Whitmore's presence could threaten. He left earlier than usual that day. He lay awake that night for a long time. The thing about grief, the thing nobody told you and that you had to discover slowly and badly on your own, was that it didn't just take the person you lost. It took the version of yourself that had existed in relation to that person. Nathan at 25, The man who had been building a house and a future and a garden for flowers with no practical purpose, that man was gone as completely as Clara was. What remained was Nathan Reed, the carpenter, useful and capable and present enough to satisfy the social requirements of a small town, but absent in a way that had become so familiar it no longer felt like absence. It just felt like himself. Until recently. The thing he was afraid to name directly, lying in the dark of his bedroom with the wind against the window and the cold pressing through the walls in the way it did in Montana winters, the thing was this. He had started looking forward to things again. Specific things. The Wednesday deliveries. The coffee that was always stronger than he expected. The particular quality of Grace's attention when he was working, which was not hovering but was present. The way someone watches a thing they find genuinely interesting. He had started looking forward to the moment in a conversation when she said something that was exactly right in a way he hadn't anticipated, because she did this regularly. She had a way of finding the clear center of a thing and saying it without decoration. And he had started to anticipate it the way you anticipate something good. This terrified him. He knew, because he was 31 and had already lived through the unmistakable experience of loving someone, he knew what this feeling was the beginning of. He could not pretend it was something else. He was building something inside himself without quite having decided to. The way a structure sometimes develops its own momentum once you've started the framing, and he was becoming aware that stopping it was going to require actively taking it apart rather than simply pausing. And he did not know if he could survive building something and having it taken again. Clara had not been taken by anything that could have been prevented or predicted or argued with. It was the pure randomness of it that had left him with no place to put the anger, because there was nothing to be angry at, no decision that had been wrong, no action that could have changed the outcome. She had been there, and then she had not been there, and the world had continued in every other respect as if this were a manageable fact. He had understood since then, on some cellular level that bypassed rational thought, that the only way to avoid that kind of loss was to not build anything that could be lost. He understood now, lying in the cold dark, that he had been building anyway. January came in hard, the way January did in Willow Creek. Not as a new beginning, the way people in warmer places seemed to experience it, but simply as the deepest part of winter, the weeks when the cold was not dramatic anymore but simply constant, pressing, grinding at everything. The firewood supply mattered. The integrity of your windows mattered. Whether your roof had any weakness mattered in a way you stopped thinking about in July. Nathan kept working. He kept showing up to Grace's shop, which was warmer than his workshop now because she ran the stove all day, and because he told himself there were still things to be done, which was not entirely untrue. There was always something in an older building, but was not entirely the reason either. What changed in January was that he stopped pretending, at least to himself, that it was only about the repairs. He did not say this to Grace. He was not ready for what saying it would mean. But he stopped maintaining the internal fiction, which had begun to cost more than he could easily sustain. He watched her work more than he had allowed himself to do before. The way she moved through her shop, efficient, purposeful, but occasionally stopping to hold a piece of fabric up to the south window light and tilt her head in the particular way she did when she was assessing something she wasn't sure about yet. The way she talked to her customers, which was different from how she talked to Nathan, warmer on the surface but less real, the warmth of service rather than the warmth of actual interest. He had come to understand that the way Grace Harper talked to most people was her public self, and that the way she talked to him, direct, questioning, willing to let silence be silence, was something she offered more carefully. He did not take that for granted. On a Thursday in the last week of January, she asked him something she had not asked before. She had been working at her machine, and Nathan had been finishing the installation of the new display shelving on the south wall, and they had not spoken for perhaps 40 minutes, a comfortable silence, the kind they had developed, when she said, without looking up, "Are you lonely, Nathan?" He was still for a moment with a screw half turned. "I've gotten used to it," he said. "That's not the same as not being lonely." "No," he agreed. "It's not." Grace stopped the machine. She looked at him across the room with the afternoon light behind her from the south windows. "I'm not trying to push anything," she said. I notice things. And I think you do too. A pause. I'm not Clara. I couldn't be, and I wouldn't want to be. But I'm here, and whatever you're carrying around, you don't have to carry all of it alone. The room was very quiet. Nathan finished turning the screw. He tested the shelf with both hands to make sure it was solid. Then he picked up his tools slowly, in the deliberate way he did things. I know, he said, and that was all. But something in the way he said it, the weight he let it carry, was different from the way he had said I know to anything in a long time. The shelf was solid, the shop was warm. Outside, the January wind moved through the empty street and rearranged the snow on the window ledge, and neither of them spoke again for a while. But the silence between them had shifted into something that both of them recognized and neither was ready to name. And for now, for this moment, in the last cold days of winter, that was enough. February in Willow Creek had a particular cruelty to it that Nathan had never found a good way to describe to people who hadn't lived through a Montana winter. It wasn't the cold itself. By February, you had made your accommodations with the cold, found your rhythms, learned which layers worked and which didn't, accepted that the world was going to be a certain gray-white color for months, and that fighting that fact was a waste of energy. What February had that the earlier months didn't was length, the knowledge that you were not at the beginning anymore and not yet at the end, and that the distance between where you stood and the first real warmth of spring was still a thing that had to be endured one day at a time. Nathan had spent a lot of February evenings in Grace's shop. He had stopped inventing reasons. He still fixed things. There was always something, and in a building as old as hers, there genuinely was more than enough to keep him occupied. But he had stopped the private fiction of pretending that the work was the reason he was there. He arrived, he fixed what needed fixing, and then sometimes he stayed and they talked or they didn't talk, or Grace worked while Nathan sat on the stool she had quietly positioned near the stove sometime in January. He had not seen her move it, and she had not mentioned it. It had simply appeared there as an acknowledgement of his visits. And he watched the fire and let himself be somewhere other than alone. What he had not done was say anything further about what Grace had put on the table in January, the question she had asked, the thing she had offered. He had turned it over in his mind every night since, the way you turn a piece of wood over in the lamplight looking for the flaw that will ruin it if you don't find it in time. He kept looking for the reason it was wrong, the argument that would let him put the feeling back in the box where he had kept it for 5 years. He couldn't find one. That was the problem. He could find fear, and he could find a long history of choosing the pain he already knew over the risk of a new one. But he could not find a reason that was actually about Grace. So he stayed in the middle, which is where people stay when they can't move forward and won't move back. The dream came on a Tuesday night in the second week of February. Nathan was not a man who put stock in dreams. He was practical by training and by disposition. And he had always understood the brain's nighttime activity as machinery working through the detritus of the day, sorting, filing, occasionally misfiring into something that felt significant but wasn't. He had dreamed of Clara before, in the years immediately after she died. Those dreams had been cruel in the specific way that dreams of the lost are cruel. She was simply alive in them, present and ordinary, and the grief was not in the dream itself but in waking up. This dream was different. Clara was sitting on the porch of the house he had framed for them and never finished, the house that still stood out on the parcel of land he had never been able to sell, 3 walls and a partial roof that the valley's weather had been slowly working on for 5 years. She was sitting on the edge of the porch floor, feet hanging, watching the field the way she used to watch things she liked, with that particular quality of attention she'd had, fully present, not thinking about somewhere else. Nathan was standing in the yard. He said her name. She looked at him. She looked exactly as she had, which was both the hardest part and the part that somehow didn't hurt the way it used to. You're still not done with it, she said. He thought she meant the house. I know, he said. I don't mean the house, Nathan. She looked at the field again. You know how to build things. You always have. You just keep building everything except the one thing you're actually supposed to be working on. He didn't answer. I'm not coming back, Claire said, not unkindly, just clearly. That's not how it works. And you know that. I know that, he said. Then stop waiting. He woke up at 4 in the morning with the room dark around him and the cold of the night pressed against the window, and the particular hollow feeling of having been somewhere true. He lay still for a long time. He did not go back to sleep. In the morning, he went to his workshop before breakfast. He stood in front of the canvas-covered shape in the corner for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he pulled the canvas off. The hope chest looked exactly as he had left it. 5 years under canvas in a workshop had not diminished it. Walnut was dense and resistant, and he had finished it well enough that the surface was still smooth to the touch, still showing the deep grain and natural figure he had chosen the board for. The carved vines along the exterior were intact. The cedar lining still carried its faint smell when he opened the lid. He stood looking at it for a long time, with his hand on the edge of the open lid. Then he got to work. He did not tell Grace about the dream. He did not tell her about the hope chest or what uncovering it had cost him, or what it meant that he had done it. Some things needed to be worked through privately before they could become words, and Nathan Reed had always processed things with his hands before he processed them with language. What changed was visible in smaller ways. He started arriving at her shop with things he had made rather than just repairs he intended to do. A small wooden box for her thread spools, sized to fit the shelf near her machine, with individual compartments he had measured against the spools she used most. A weather strip for the bottom of the back door that he had cut and fitted on his own initiative without being asked, because he had noticed the cold draft when the wind came from the north. A new sign bracket for above the shop front, stronger than the original, because he had looked at the old one and not liked how it was anchored. Grace received all of these without making too much of them. She thanked him. She used them. She did not perform gratitude in the way that would have made Nathan uncomfortable. She simply incorporated the things into her life the way you incorporate something that belongs there. But she was watching him. He knew she was watching him. The third week of February, she stopped him as he was putting on his jacket to leave. "Nathan." He turned. She was standing in the middle of her shop with her arms crossed, not in a defensive way, but in the way a person stands when they have been deciding whether to say something and have finally decided. "What are you doing?" she asked. He looked at his jacket. "Leaving." "I don't mean right now." She held his gaze. "I mean, the box for the thread, the weather strip, the sign bracket." A pause. "What are you doing?" He was quiet for a moment. "Something I should have said something about instead of just doing," he admitted. "Okay," Grace said. "So say something." The shop was quiet. The stove was low and comfortable. Outside, a horse went past on Main Street, hooves muffled in the packed snow. "I don't have this worked out," Nathan said. "I'm not asking for worked out. I've been—" He stopped, tried again. "I spent 5 years not wanting anything. I got comfortable with it, and then you showed up and I started wanting things again, and I don't entirely know what to do with that." Grace didn't say anything immediately. She looked at him with an expression that was serious but not unkind. "What kind of things?" she asked. "A reason to be somewhere other than my workshop." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "You. Specifically." The word sat there between them, specifically. It was more precise than he had intended to be and more honest, and it had come out before he could shape it into something safer. Grace exhaled slowly. "Nathan, I've been, She stopped as well. "I came here to start something new. I wasn't looking for this particular complication." "I know. But I'm also not going to tell you that I haven't noticed or that I don't—" She paused. "I do, notice, feel, whatever the right word is." He looked at her. "I'm just not interested in half of something," Grace said. "I've had people care about me in ways that didn't quite commit, and it was worse than being alone. So if you're telling me you want something, I need to know you actually mean it, not that you're trying it out." "That's fair," Nathan said. "It's not about fair, it's about what I can sustain." She uncrossed her arms. "I don't want to be the woman you almost chose." The word hit him. Almost. He had not heard it used as a weight before. But it was. It was exactly that. A weight. The weight of all the almost choices he had made for 5 years. "You wouldn't be," he said. He said it without calculation, which was the only way the right things ever came out of him. Grace looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said quietly. Neither of them moved to change the distance between them. This was not a story where that moment became something immediate and certain. What it was instead was an acknowledgement, a careful, true acknowledgement that both of them felt something real and both of them were a little afraid of it, and that for now, that was where things stood. Nathan went home. He slept better than he had in weeks. March came with a slow thaw that made everything muddy and difficult before it made anything green, which was exactly how spring worked in Montana, and no less annoying for being predictable. The work picked up again as it did every spring. Roofs to be checked for winter damage, outbuildings to be assessed, the Callaway barn expansion that had been planned since autumn and was finally ready to begin. Nathan was busy. Grace was busy. Spring brought a surge of commissions as women who had been thinking about new dresses through the winter finally came in to order them. They saw each other less frequently, which was a different kind of test than the long winter evenings had been. He found that the wanting didn't diminish with less contact. If anything, it clarified, the way a view clarifies when you step back from it. He thought about her during the Callaway job, in the early mornings when he was riding out before the rest of the crew arrived, in a way that was not obsessive but was consistent. The particular way a thought returns not because you're forcing it, but because it has established a place in you. He told his father. Thomas Reed was 64 and had been the first carpenter in the valley before Nathan surpassed him, and he had the quality of very old-fashioned men in that he never offered his opinion unless asked for it, but when asked, he did not hedge. Nathan explained the situation, briefly, without excess detail, sitting at his father's kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in early March. Thomas listened without interrupting. He poured coffee. He was quiet for a moment after Nathan finished. "What do you want me to say?" Thomas asked. "I don't know. Something useful." Thomas turned his coffee cup in his hands. "You want to know if it's wrong to feel it." "I want to know if it means I'm forgetting her." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had also lost someone, Nathan's mother, 20 years ago now. And Nathan had watched him navigate that loss with a practicality that Nathan had always admired and sometimes, in darker moments, resented for looking easier than it was. "No," Thomas said, "it doesn't mean that." He looked at his son. "Clara would have told you the same thing. You know that." "I know what she would have said. I don't know if I believe it applies." "That's not a question about Clara," Thomas said. "That's a question about whether you think you deserve something good again." Nathan looked at his coffee. "Do you?" Thomas asked. No answer came immediately. That was answer enough, probably, but Thomas didn't press it. He let it sit. That was what the Reed men did with difficult things. They let them sit until they became clear, or until they became something you had to act on despite the lack of clarity. Wholesome. The Willow Creek Harvest Fair that year fell on the last Saturday of September. It was a town tradition that had been running since before Nathan was born. 2 days of market stalls, music, food, livestock judging, and the general organized chaos of a community that spent most of its years spread across a wide valley finally gathering in one place. Nathan attended every year. He stayed an hour. He fulfilled the social obligation and left. This year he stayed 4 hours, which was not something he planned. He helped set up the framework for the music platform in the morning because they were short 2 men and someone asked him to. He stayed through the first lunch because the work had run long and he was hungry. He stayed through the afternoon because he was there and the afternoon was fine, and the reason he usually left early, the feeling of being present in a crowd while being essentially absent, the loneliness of public spaces, had lost some of its force. He was watching a demonstration of rope braiding near the north end of the fairground when he saw Grace. She was not alone. This was not unexpected. Grace had been in Willow Creek for over a year by now, and she had built relationships, had customers who had become acquaintances, and acquaintances who had become something close to friends. The women she was standing with were Mrs. Callaway's daughter-in-law and 2 of the Whitmore sisters. They were laughing at something. Grace was wearing a dark blue dress that he understood, now that he knew her, she had made herself. James Whitmore was also nearby. Not standing with her, standing at the edge of the adjacent group, but positioned with the awareness of a young man who is tracking someone without wanting to appear to do so. Nathan recognized this because he was guilty of the same thing from 50 yards further away. He watched James Whitmore watch Grace laugh. The feeling that moved through him was not comfortable. It was not the mild, manageable feeling of general concern. It was specific and sharp, and settled in his chest in a way that was impossible to misidentify. He was jealous. Not of James Whitmore in particular, who was not a bad person and had done nothing wrong. He was jealous of anyone standing that close to her, of the ease of it, of the possibility. And underneath the jealousy was something worse, the terror that he had taken too long, that he had spent 3 seasons doing the careful, slow work of almost deciding while something outside his control had been running on its own timeline. He crossed the fairground. He did not have a plan. He arrived at the edge of the group, and Grace looked up and saw him, and the expression that moved across her face was not surprise. She had learned to expect him in a way she didn't bother to hide anymore, but it was warm, and it was immediate, and it was his in a way that James Whitmore's carefully positioned proximity could not manufacture. "Nathan," she said. "Grace," he nodded to the others. Mrs. Calloway's daughter-in-law gave him the particular look of a woman who had been following this situation with interest for months. He ignored it. "I didn't know you stayed past noon at these things," Grace said. "I've been expanding my range." Something shifted in her expression, amusement, or something close to it, pressed down by the awareness of the other people present. "Have you?" "I was hoping you might walk around some," he said. He said it plainly, without dressing it up or making it complicated. He was not good at performing casual, so he didn't try. "If you were finished here." Grace looked at him for a moment. Then she said her goodbyes to the women around her, brief, warm, unapologetic, and fell into step beside him. They walked the perimeter of the fairground. They stopped to look at things that interested them. A display of hand-forged ironwork that Nathan examined with professional attention. A quilt competition that Grace assessed with the focused eye of someone who understood what she was looking at. They ate fried bread from a vendor near the east fence, and Grace complained with some sincerity that it wasn't as good as she remembered from a fair she'd attended as a child. And Nathan said he had never thought it was particularly good, and Grace said then why were they eating it? And Nathan said because it was there, which made her laugh in the reluctant way he had come to look for. It was the most ordinary afternoon Nathan had spent in years. Ordinary in the way that only feels possible when something has shifted underneath. They were standing near the fence at the far end of the grounds, watching the cattle judging with no particular investment in the outcome, when Grace said, without looking at him, "James Whitmore is going to ask me to the autumn social." Nathan was quiet. "He mentioned it last week," she continued, carefully, the way people mention things they're planning to do. Nathan watched the cattle. "I haven't said yes," Grace said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at him now with that directness she had, the quality of not looking away from things. "I don't want you to say yes," Nathan said. "I know." A pause. "That's why I'm telling you." The cattle were being moved into the judging pen. Someone in the crowd shouted something appreciative about a particularly large animal. The afternoon light was coming in low from the west, the way it did in September in Montana, golden and angled, making everything look more significant than it was. "I haven't been fair to you," Nathan said. "You've been honest about where you were." "That's not the same thing." Grace didn't argue with that. "No, it's not." "I meant what I said in February," Nathan said, "and I mean it more now." He stopped. He was not a man who organized speeches in advance, and he did not try to now. He said it the way it was. "I'm not all the way through what happened to me. I don't know that you can be all the way through something like that, but I know that I don't want to be on this side of the fence from you anymore, and I know that whatever I still carry, I'd rather carry it where you are than put it down somewhere you're not." Grace was looking at him. He could not entirely read her expression. She was not a woman whose face gave everything away immediately, which was one of the things that had drawn him to her from the beginning, the sense that what she showed you was real, not performed. "That's not nothing," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than usual. "I know it's not everything." "I didn't say I needed everything." She looked away, then back. "I said I didn't want to be the woman you almost chose. That's different." "You're not almost," Nathan said. "That's what I'm telling you." A long moment. The light moved. Somewhere behind them, the music started up again. "Okay," Grace said. "Just okay?" But she said it like something settled, not like something provisional, and Nathan understood the difference. They walked back through the fair in the long afternoon light, and Nathan did not go home when the hour got late. He stayed until the music stopped, for the first time in 5 years, because there was somewhere he wanted to be. He rode home in the dark, with the stars very clear above the valley and the cold of the coming autumn in the air. He should have felt lighter. He had said the thing. She had heard it. What he felt instead, underneath the something that was almost relief, was the very beginning of a terror so old and so specific that he recognized it immediately. Because it was real now. It was out in the open now. And real things, in his experience, were the only things that could be taken. He did not sleep when he got home. He sat in his workshop for a long time, in the lamplight, not working. The hope chest was where he had left it, uncovered, lid closed, sitting against the wall where the light reached it now. He sat with it for a long time. And sometime after midnight, when the lamp was burning low and the workshop had gone very cold, he made a decision. He didn't know yet if it was the right one or the wrong one. He only knew it was the one fear made for him. He began to write a letter to a contractor in Billings who had offered him a major commission 6 months ago and whom he had turned down without a real explanation. His hand was steady, months ago, and whom he had turned down without a real explanation. His hand was steady. His hand was always steady. That had never been the part of him that shook. The letter went out on a Monday. Nathan had written it twice. The first version had been too long. Explanations he didn't owe anyone. Justifications that were really just him arguing with himself on paper. He burned that one in the workshop stove at 2 a.m. and wrote the second version in plain sentences. He was available for the Billings Commission if the offer still stood. He could start in 3 weeks. He was a reliable man and did good work, and the contractor in Billings, a man named Gerald Foss, already knew both of those things from reputation. Foss wrote back in 8 days. The offer stood. The project was a large commercial building in the center of Billings, a hardware and dry goods enterprise that needed custom millwork throughout, built-in cabinetry, detailed finish work that would take the better part of a year. Good money. Serious work. The kind of commission that could establish a reputation beyond the valley. Nathan read the letter twice, folded it, and put it in his jacket pocket. He went to bed. He lay in the dark for a long time. In the morning he told his father. Thomas Reed listened to the whole thing without expression. He was eating breakfast, oatmeal, which he had eaten every morning of his adult life with a consistency that Nathan had always found both admirable and faintly depressing. He did not look up from the bowl until Nathan finished. "When do you leave?" Thomas asked. 2 weeks. Thomas nodded. He took another spoonful. "You're not going to say anything," Nathan said. "I said what I had to say in March." Thomas set down his spoon. He looked at his son with the particular patience of a man who had watched this particular son make decisions for 31 years and had learned that some decisions had to be made wrong before they could be made right. "You're a grown man. You do what you think is right." "I think it's the right move." Thomas picked up his spoon again. "Okay." Nathan left. He stood on his father's porch for a moment in the October morning, cold and still, with the mountains visible to the west in the clear air. He had expected his father to push back. He had, he realized, wanted his father to push back. Wanted someone to provide the argument that would either hold him here or release him without guilt from the decision to go. Thomas Reed had declined to do that, which was, when Nathan thought about it, the most honest thing the old man could have done. He walked home and started organizing what he would need to take. Sad. He did not tell Grace directly. He told himself this was because he hadn't fully worked out what to say, which was partially true. He was not a man who handled unformed conversations well. He liked to know what he meant before he opened his mouth, and what he meant about leaving was still tangled enough that he could not have stated it clearly. What he did instead, on a Wednesday afternoon 6 days before he was due to depart, was go to her shop one last time. He had not been there since the harvest fair. 3 weeks of distance that Grace had not commented on and Nathan had not explained. He had told himself he was giving them both space to think. He had not examined whether that was true. When he walked in, Grace looked up from her work, and her expression did what it always did. Registered him, warmed slightly, settled. Then she looked at him more carefully, the way she looked at things she was assessing, and something changed in her face. "You're leaving," she said. He had not said a word. He stood off him before he opened his mouth. "How did you know that?" he asked. "You have the same look you get when you've decided something." She set down her work. "Where?" "Billings. There's a commission. A large one. It came up in the spring and I put it off. I've accepted it." Grace was quiet. She was looking at him in a way that was very still, the way still water is still, not empty, but deep and not showing everything. "How long?" she asked. 8 months, maybe 10. She nodded once, slow. "Grace, don't," she said, not angry. Her voice was level in the way a voice gets when the person using it is being very deliberate. "Don't explain it in a way that makes it about the commission." He was quiet. "Is it because of what you said at the fair?" she asked. He should have said no. He had a no ready, had been carrying it, had thought it through, had the argument that it was about professional opportunity and timing, and the simple reality that a man had to build his life on solid ground before he could invite someone into it. He had the whole construction of it ready. "Partly," he said. Grace stood up. She walked to the window, the same window he had reframed in October of last year, the one that no longer let the cold in, and she looked out at the street for a moment. When she turned back, her expression was not what he had expected. He had expected hurt. He had expected anger or the cold withdrawal that hurt feelings sometimes produced. What he saw instead was something that looked almost like clarity, like she had already worked through the part he was still stuck in. "You're afraid," she said. "I know that. And you're leaving because of it." "I know that too." "Okay." She crossed her arms, but gently. "Then I need you to hear something, and I need you to actually hear it, not just wait for me to finish so you can say what you've already decided." He waited. "I never asked you to not be afraid," Grace said. I'm not standing here expecting you to be someone who doesn't carry what you carry. I know what happened to you. I know it's not a small thing, and I know it doesn't just go away because enough time has passed." She paused. "But I'm not Clara. And whatever you're running from right now, I am not the thing that's going to hurt you, and somewhere you know that." The shop was quiet around them, the stove, the fabric, the particular smell of the space that Nathan had come to know so well it barely registered anymore. "I'm not running from you," he said. "Then what are you running from?" He could not answer that cleanly. The truth was that he did not have a clean answer, only a tangled one. Fear of loving someone and watching the world take them, fear of having something real and then not having it, fear of the specific unbearable quality of that particular loss. None of which was Grace's fault, and none of which she could fix by being a certain kind of person or saying a certain kind of thing. "I don't know how to be in something good without waiting for it to end," he said. It was the most honest thing he had said in years, possibly ever, and he said it to the floor between them. Grace was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said softly. "I know that." And she said it without pity, which was the only way he could have taken it. But Nathan, running away from it doesn't make the ending less possible. It just makes sure you're already gone when it matters. He had nothing to say to that, not because it wasn't true, but because it was, completely, and he had known it since he wrote the letter, and knowing a thing and being able to act against your fear of it were not the same territory. "I have to go," he said. Grace looked at him. Her jaw was set slightly, the way it got when she was holding herself steady. "I know you do," she said. He put on his hat. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame he had repaired, the one that fit properly now, that kept the cold where it belonged. He didn't turn around. He didn't have the words for what he wanted to say, and he had already said too many words that were short of what he meant. He left. On the morning he departed, he went to his workshop before first light. He had packed what he needed the night before: tools, clothes, the practical contents of a man's life that could be reduced to 2 bags when required. The workshop was cold, the fire having gone out hours ago. He lit a lamp and stood in the familiar space for a moment, looking at the bench where he had worked for years. The tools hung in their order on the wall, the smell of the place that was as much a part of him as anything he could name. He took a small piece of walnut from the scrap bin. He sat at the bench and he worked for an hour in the lamplight, because his hands needed something to do, and because the thing he was making was the only language he had for what he couldn't say. When he was done, he set a small carved flower on the corner of the workbench. It was a wild columbine, the kind that grew along creek banks in the valley. He had carved it the way he carved everything, carefully, from the inside out, finding the shape that was already in the wood. It was not perfect. The outer petals were slightly uneven, and there was a tool mark on the stem he hadn't been able to fully clean up in the low light. But it was real, and it was the thing he meant, and he left it there. He loaded his horse in the pre-dawn dark and rode out of Willow Creek without stopping anywhere. He did not look back. He told himself that was the strong thing to do. He told himself that for the first 100 miles. Grace found the flower that afternoon. She had not gone to his workshop. She would not do that. But old Thomas Reed came by her shop at noon, something he had never done before, and told her that Nathan had gone that morning and had left something on his bench that she might want. Thomas said it plainly, without editorializing, and then he left, and Grace stood in her shop for 10 minutes before she walked the 3 blocks to the workshop Nathan had left unlocked. The space was cold and still, and carried the particular absence of a place where someone has been for a long time and isn't anymore. She stood at the bench and looked at the carved flower for a long time without touching it. Then she picked it up. She turned it over in her hands. She could feel the care in it, the hours, the intention, the thing he had meant and couldn't say with words. She understood all of that. She had always understood Nathan Reed better than he understood himself. What she understood also, standing in the cold workshop with the carved flower in her hands, was that understanding someone's pain was not the same as being willing to wait indefinitely for them to outrun it. She set the flower in her coat pocket. She walked back to her shop. She sat down at her sewing machine and she worked for the rest of the afternoon. And she did not let herself cry until she was home that evening with the door closed, which was the private rule she had made for herself a long time ago about which feelings she was allowed to have in which spaces. She was not willing to be the woman he almost chose. She had said that. She had meant it. She picked up her work the next day and the day after that, because that was what you did. Billings was larger than Willow Creek in every way. Noisier, faster, less settled. The kind of place where nobody particularly knew your name or your history, which Nathan had thought might be a relief and turned out not to be. The Foss Commission was everything it had promised. Complex, demanding, the kind of work that required his full concentration for 10 and 12 hours at a time. The building was 4 stories, which was unusual for Montana, and the interior millwork was elaborate enough that Nathan spent the first 2 weeks just planning the sequence of the work before he cut a single piece of wood. Foss was a practical man who asked direct questions and paid on schedule and didn't involve himself in the craft decisions once he'd established Nathan knew what he was doing. The other workers on the site were competent. The boarding house where Nathan rented a room was clean and quiet. Everything was fine. Nothing was right. He noticed it first in the evenings, which had always been when his workshop felt most like itself. The particular satisfaction of the end of a productive day, the visible progress of a thing becoming what it was meant to be. In Billings, the evenings felt like spaces he was filling with activity rather than rest. He ate supper at the boarding house with other men whose names he knew, and whose company was perfectly adequate. He read. He planned the next day's work. He went to sleep early because early rising was necessary. He did not look forward to anything. This was not new. He had not looked forward to things in Willow Creek for 5 years before Grace arrived. But it was different now because now he knew the difference. He had felt what it was like to look forward to a Wednesday delivery, to the sound of a sewing machine stopping because someone wanted to ask him something, to coffee that was always stronger than expected. He had it and he had walked away from it, and the absence was not the clean, neutral absence of before. It was a specific absence, shaped exactly like the thing it was missing. He worked. He was very good at working. In November, he finished the second-floor millwork 2 weeks ahead of schedule, and Foss said something about what that meant for the project timeline, and Nathan nodded and noted it and walked back to his boarding house in the early dark and sat on the edge of his bed and thought about a carved flower sitting on a workbench in an empty workshop. He wondered if Grace had found it. He wondered what she'd thought. He wondered if she had said yes to anything James Whitmore had proposed since September. That last thought kept him awake until well past midnight, which was not useful, and which he recognized as not useful, and which happened anyway. December arrived and brought with it the quality of winter that Billings shared with Willow Creek. The bone cold, the short days, the sense of the world contracting to a smaller, more interior space. Nathan worked through it. He did the kind of work that required a man to be so technically focused that there was no space for anything else, and he valued that aspect of it more than he had expected to. He received a letter from his father in the second week of December. Thomas Reed wrote the way he talked, economically, without decoration. The letter reported the relevant facts. The roof on the old Paulson place had finally given out and been replaced. 2 of the Callaway cattle had died in a cold snap. The town council had approved a new water cistern system. The last paragraph said, "Harper Seamstress is still open. She put a new sign up. It looks good." Nathan read that paragraph 4 times. Then he folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket and went back to work. His father had said nothing further, just the fact, offered without comment. Nathan thought about that for a long time. The information his father had decided to include. The information his father had decided was relevant when reporting the news of Willow Creek to his son who had left. He thought about what Grace had said, standing by the window he had fixed. Running away from it doesn't make the ending less possible. It just makes sure you're already gone when it matters. He was very good at working. He was very efficient and technically skilled and reliable. And the building in Billings was going to be an excellent building when it was done. Foss would recommend him. He would have no shortage of future work. He sat with that fact in the cold December dark and tried to find in it the thing he thought he had been looking for when he left. The safety of it. The managed distance from everything that could hurt him. What he found instead was that it was a very particular kind of loneliness, not the blank loneliness of before Grace, which had been endurable because he hadn't known what he was missing, but the pointed, specific loneliness of a man who had looked directly at the thing he wanted and then put several hundred miles between himself and it because he was afraid. He had been afraid. He was still afraid. The fear had not diminished with distance or with time or with any amount of excellent carpentry. The difference was that he was starting to understand, sitting in a boarding house in Billings in December, that the fear was not going to go away. Not completely. Not ever. He was going to carry some version of what had happened to him for the rest of his life, and he had 2 choices about where to carry it. Here, in this clean and adequate and completely empty life, or somewhere that mattered. He lay down. He did not sleep for a long time. Sometime near morning, in the hour before the sky began to lighten, he made the decision. Not dramatically, not with the sense of revelation he might have hoped for. He made it the way he made most decisions, quietly, in the dark, after he had been through every other option and found them wanting. He was going back to Willow Creek. He was going to tell Grace the truth, all of it, without protecting himself or managing the way it landed, and she was going to tell him what she needed to tell him, and whatever happened after that was going to be realer than anything he'd felt in the last 3 months in Billings. He might be too late. He knew that. He had known it since November, lying awake thinking about James Whitmore and the autumn social, and the fact that Grace was a woman who did not wait indefinitely for men to make up their minds. She had told him that clearly, and she had meant it. He might arrive back in Willow Creek and find that she had made a life in the space he had vacated, and that would be what it was. He would have made it what it was, but he was not going to stay in Billings and wonder. In the morning, he went to find Gerald Foss. Well, Foss was a fair man, but not a sentimental one, and Nathan did not try to make it something it wasn't. He explained that he needed to leave, that he understood the inconvenience, that the 2nd and 3rd floor millwork was complete, and the plans for the remaining work were documented clearly enough that any competent carpenter could follow them, and that he would forfeit the remaining portion of his fee without dispute. Foss looked at him for a long moment across the unfinished building site. The morning was cold, breath visible, the winter sky flat and white above Billings. "This is about a woman," Foss said. He said it without judgment, just the reasonable conclusion of a man who had watched his best worker produce flawless carpentry for 3 months while looking like someone carrying something heavy. "It is," Nathan said. Foss was quiet for a moment. "The mill work you've done is the best work this project will have in it," he said. "I want you to know I know that." He held out his hand. "Go do what you need to do, Reed." Nathan shook it. He was on the road before noon. He had packed the night before, the same 2 bags he had arrived with, plus the tools he'd brought from Willow Creek, and one addition, the scrap of walnut he'd meant to leave behind, and had found himself packing almost without deciding to, because his hands had known what his brain was still working through. The ride back was 2 days with an overnight in a way station. The weather held, cold but clear, the road firm under the frost. Nathan rode without hurrying unreasonably and without dawdling. He thought, for most of the ride, about what he was going to say. He had been a man who needed to know what he meant before he opened his mouth. He had always been that. He thought about what he meant now, turning it over for 2 days in the saddle, and what he arrived at was not a speech and not a plan. It was just the truth, which was the only currency he had that was worth anything. He had left because he was afraid. He had spent 3 months being afraid in Billings, and it had been no different from being afraid in Willow Creek, except that she wasn't there, which made it worse in every way that mattered. He was still afraid. He was going to be afraid for a while, but he was not willing to let that be the reason his life was the shape it was. He had built things for other people his entire life. Houses, barns, furniture, shelving in a seamstress shop. He had built things that would stand for decades after he was gone. And he had been good at it, and it had been enough. It had been everything. Right up until the point when it wasn't. He knew how to build. He had always known how to build. He had simply spent 5 years forgetting that he was allowed to build something for himself. Willow Creek appeared on the afternoon of the second day, coming up over a low rise in the winter light. The cluster of buildings in the valley, smoke from the chimneys, the familiar shape of the mountains beyond. Nathan had ridden out of this town dozens of times on various jobs. He had always ridden back in the same way, a man returning to work, to the ordinary fact of his life. This time was different. He rode down Main Street and he tied his horse in front of Harper's Seamstress and Alterations, which had a new sign. Thomas had been right. It was a good sign. She had done it herself. And he stood in front of the door for a moment. He went inside. Grace was at her machine. She looked up when the door opened the way she always had, and then she went very still. She did not say anything. She was waiting. She had learned, in the course of knowing him, how to wait for him to find the words. Nathan took his hat off. He stood inside the door of the shop that was warmer than anywhere else in his life, and he said what he had come to say. "I was wrong to leave," he said. "Not about the job, about the reason. I was afraid, and I made a decision out of fear, and I dressed it up as something else, and I wasn't honest with you about it when I went." He paused. "I'm not past what happened to me. I don't know when I will be, but I know that I came back here because there was nothing in Billings worth staying for, and there was something here worth coming back to, and I would rather spend the rest of my life being a little afraid and here than spend it being safe and nowhere near you." The shop was very quiet. Grace had not moved from her chair. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. Not the careful steadiness she usually kept, but something underneath that, something less composed. "You forfeit the commission?" she asked. "Yes." "The whole thing?" "Yes." She was quiet for another moment. "That was a lot of money, Nathan." "I know." "Was it worth it?" He looked at her. "I'm here, aren't I?" Something broke open slightly in her face. Not tears. She was not a woman who cried easily, he knew that, but the expression that came before, the one people have when something has been held tightly for a long time and is finally allowed to loosen. "I didn't say yes to the autumn social," she said. "I know." He hadn't known. He had hoped, but he said it with the certainty of a man who needed it to be true. "James Whitmore asked someone else," Grace said. "In November." A pause. "I told him I wasn't available, which was—" She stopped. "Which was probably optimistic of me." "It was right," Nathan said. She stood up. She was not a small woman. She met his eye directly. And she crossed the shop and stopped in front of him with the same directness she had brought to everything from the first moment she had commented on his white oak board on Main Street. "Don't do that again," she said. "I won't. I mean it. I can handle fear. I can handle slow. I cannot handle you leaving without telling me the real reason." "I know." He held her gaze. "I won't." She looked at him for a long moment, reading him the way she always had, finding what was underneath the words. Whatever she found, it was enough. She didn't move toward him, and he didn't move toward her, not yet. They stood in the middle of her warm shop with the afternoon light coming through the south windows, and both of them a little uncertain and a little steady at the same time, which was about as honest as two people could be with each other. It was enough. It was the beginning of enough. The days after Nathan's return were not simple. That would have been too easy, and nothing about Nathan Reed had ever been easy, not even the good things. He moved back into his workshop, took up his regular work again, and began the slow process of re-establishing himself in a town that had watched him leave and was now watching him come back with the particular attention of a community that had always treated his personal life as a matter of collective interest. People said things. Hector Grimes mentioned the Billings job in a tone that suggested he had opinions about unfinished business. Mrs. Calloway, never a woman to leave significance unvoiced, told Nathan directly in the middle of the feed store that she was glad he had come to his senses before Grace Harper found someone with better timing. Nathan took all of it without argument. He had earned the commentary. He understood that. What he had not anticipated, or had anticipated and not prepared for adequately, was the period of adjustment between his return and whatever came next. He and Grace did not simply fall into something the day after he walked back into her shop. Real things did not work that way, and they were both old enough and sufficiently acquainted with disappointment to know better than to treat a good beginning as an immediate resolution. What they did instead was more careful and more honest, and in some ways harder. They had supper together on a Thursday, 3 days after his return. Grace cooked, bean soup again, the same thing she had made that first November evening, which Nathan understood was not an accident. They sat at her small table in the back room, and they talked about the things that needed to be talked about without either of them performing a version of themselves that was braver or more certain than the truth. "I need to tell you something," Nathan said halfway through the meal. Grace looked up. When I made that decision, part of what I was doing was testing something." He said it uncomfortably, because it was not a comfortable thing. "Not testing you, testing myself. Seeing if I could go and feel nothing, and then I could tell myself what I felt was just circumstantial, just proximity." "And," Grace said, "it wasn't circumstantial." She held his gaze for a moment. "I know. You wouldn't have come back if it was. I should have figured that out without leaving." "Yes," she said simply, "you should have." She did not say it to be cruel. She said it because it was true, and she had promised herself she would not let him off the hook by pretending otherwise. "But you didn't, and you came back, and I need to know that the next time fear does what fear does, because it will, Nathan, it's going to come back. I need to know you're not going to put 200 miles between us first." "I know," he said. "Knowing it and doing it are different." "I know that too." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to trust that I'm fixed. I'm asking you to trust that I know what it cost me to leave. And that's not something I want to pay again." Grace was quiet for a moment. She looked at her soup, then she looked back at him. "Okay," she said, "that I can work with." It was not a romantic declaration. It was two practical people making an agreement, which was exactly what it needed to be. Nathan went to the unfinished house in early January. He had not been to the property since Clara died. 6 years of avoidance, the land sitting with its partial structure slowly being reclaimed by weather and time. 2 of the 3 walls still standing, the partial roof sagging on one end where a support had given out in a winter. He hadn't been there to maintain it. The site was a 15-minute ride east of town, and he had taken the long way around it for 6 years without fully acknowledging that he was doing so. He went alone, on a morning when the sky was clear and the cold was the dry kind that didn't cut, and he stood in front of what remained of the structure for a long time. It was less than he remembered, and also somehow more. The walls that still stood were solid. He had built them well, which was both a comfort and a specific kind of pain, the knowledge that the craftsmanship had outlasted the reason for it. The floor framing was intact beneath the snow. The foundation, which he had laid with particular care, because foundations were the thing that determined everything that came after, was exactly as he had left it. He had not told Grace he was coming here. This was something he needed to do alone. Or rather, this was the last thing he needed to do alone, before he stopped doing things alone. He walked through the space, stepping over a fallen beam near the east wall, ducking under the section of roof that still held, and stood in what had been designed as the kitchen. Clara had stood in this exact space and pointed to where she wanted the window and said she wanted it low enough to see the field without craning, and he had made a note of it and adjusted the framing and never installed the window. He stood there for a while with his hands in his coat pockets. He was not going to tell himself this didn't hurt. It did. It still hurt in the particular way that things hurt when they are real and have not been fully resolved, and he had spent 6 years trying to manage that by distance, and had learned, specifically and at considerable personal cost, that distance did not do what he had hoped. What he had also learned, standing in the cold shell of an unfinished house on a January morning in 1886, at 32 years old, was that the hurt and the moving forward were not opposites. They were the same territory, and you moved through them together, and the people who waited until the hurt was gone before they agreed to live again were people who waited forever. He was done waiting. He pulled out the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket and began to make notes. Not about what had been planned for this house, about what could be built here now, what the foundation would support, what the standing walls could be incorporated into, what a new structure on this site might look like if it was built for a different future than the one he had originally intended. He worked on the notes for an hour in the cold. His breath was visible. His fingers went stiff enough that the pencil was difficult to hold. He didn't stop. He told Grace that evening. They were sitting in her shop after closing, which had become their way, the natural end of a day that often brought them to the same space without either of them having to engineer it. He showed her the notebook. He explained what he had found and what he was thinking. Grace looked at the notes for a long time. She turned several pages. She looked at the rough sketch he had made of the foundation dimensions and the potential floor plan. "You want to build it," she said. "I want to build something on it. Not the same thing." She looked up at him. "What's the difference?" "The same thing was built for a life I was going to have. This would be built for a life I'm going to build." He paused. "If you want to be part of that." Grace set the notebook down on her work table carefully, as if it was something that warranted care. "You're asking me something," she said. "I am." "Then ask it." He was not a man who organized speeches, and he had already been through the experience of saying the right thing in the wrong way and the wrong thing when the right thing was available. He had been thinking about this since the ride back from Billings, and what he had decided was that he was going to say it plainly and mean it completely and let it be what it was. "I want to marry you," Nathan said. "I want to build a house that's ours and not a replacement for something else. And I want to stop being a man who is working hard at being alone." He held her gaze. "I know I'm not easy. I know I've got things in me that are still unresolved. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I also know that you're the person I don't want to be without, and I know that with more certainty than I've known most things." The shop was very still. Outside, the winter wind moved down Main Street and rattled something loose somewhere up the block. Grace looked at him for what felt like a long time. He let her look. "Yes," she said, not elaborated, not with conditions or qualifications attached. Just yes, said by a woman who had decided in the same direct way she decided everything. Nathan exhaled. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. And then she picked up the notebook again and said, "The kitchen window should face south." And Nathan said, "I know." And they spent the next hour talking about the house. They married in April, when the mud of early spring had dried enough to make the walk to the ceremony practical, and the first flowers were appearing in the valley with the tentative quality of things that weren't sure yet if the cold was really done. The ceremony was small. Nathan's father stood with him. Grace had written to a friend from St. Louis who made the journey and stood with her. The justice of the peace who performed the ceremony was a practical man named Aldridge, who said the necessary words without embellishment, which suited both of them. Mrs. Calloway cried in the front row with the enthusiasm of a woman who had waited longer for this than either participant and felt entitled to the emotional dividend. Grace wore a dress she had made herself, gray-blue, like the color of her shop door, fitted and practical with no excess decoration. Nathan wore his best jacket and a clean collar, and had made a visible effort with his hair that Grace noticed and said nothing about, because she found it quietly endearing that he had tried. What Nathan remembered most about the ceremony itself was not any particular moment within it, but the quality of standing next to Grace with the spring light coming through the window of the courthouse and thinking that he was in the right place. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic weight of a moment that announces itself as significant. Just the simple, solid recognition that this was the correct life, the one he was supposed to be in, the one he had spent a long time getting to. It was enough. It was more than enough. They moved into the new house in the autumn of that same year. Nathan had spent the spring and summer building it, working longer hours than he had on anything in years. Not because he was in a hurry, but because he had energy for it that he hadn't had for his own work in a long time. Grace came out to the site on Sundays when she had closed the shop and walked through the framing and asked questions and occasionally made suggestions that Nathan incorporated without being asked why he was doing it. The house was not large. It was the right size, which was different. It had a wide front porch that faced west for the evening light, a kitchen with a south-facing window set low enough to see the field without craning, a parlor with bookshelves Nathan had built floor to ceiling because Grace had more books than either of them had anticipated, and a workroom off the back where Grace set up her sewing machine and her cutting table and could work from home on the days when she didn't need to be at the shop. The garden was Grace's project. Nathan built the raised beds, cedar to keep the soil warm longer, and Grace did the rest. She planted it the way she'd always talked about wanting to plant. Not practically, not with anything you'd eat or sell or put to use, but purely for color and fragrance and the simple fact of beautiful things outside the window. By the second spring, when the perennials had established, it was visible from the road and people mentioned it. Nathan had also, on a morning he did not announce, gone to his workshop and brought out the hope chest. He carried it into the house himself, which was difficult. Walnut is heavy, and the chest was substantial, and set it in the bedroom in the morning light and stood looking at it for a moment. Grace came in while he was standing there. She looked at the chest. She looked at him. "Tell me about it," she said. So he did. He sat on the edge of the bed and he told her all of it. The black walnut board, the carved vines that were meant to look like the creek, the cedar lining, the 3 weeks of evening work, the morning he had finished it and planned to give it to Clara, and never did. He told it plainly, without dramatizing it or apologizing for it, because she had told him she didn't need him to manage what Clara meant to him. She needed him to stop hiding it. Grace listened without interrupting. When he finished, she went to the chest and opened the lid and looked at the cedar lining and the objects inside. A few small things Nathan had finally allowed himself to look at again. Letters, a pressed flower from the garden Clara had planted in the raised beds Nathan built her, a small portrait drawn by a traveling artist that had caught something true about the way she looked. Grace looked at these things carefully. She did not perform anything about it. No forced emotion in either direction, no pretending it wasn't difficult or pretending it was more difficult than it was. She was just present with it. "She was lucky to have you," Grace said finally. Nathan looked at the floor. I was lucky to have her." "I know." Grace closed the lid gently. She looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend this is easy. It's a little bit hard to look at. I want you to know that." She paused. "But I also want you to know that I'm glad it's here, and not under a canvas in the corner of your workshop, because it belongs in your life, and your life is here now." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she said honestly. "But I think the chest is you. The care in it, the way you made it. And I don't want a version of you that's had pieces of himself removed to make space for me. I want the whole thing, complicated as it is." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. It was inadequate, and it was everything he had. She sat down next to him on the edge of the bed and put her hand over his, and they stayed there for a while in the morning light without saying anything else, which was the language they had always been best at together. "What?" Years passed, the way they do, not quickly and not slowly, but in the uneven, inconsistent rhythm of actual life, where some months stretch and some years compress, and you look up at a certain point and find that you are somewhere you did not expect to be and are surprised to find it suits you. The shop did well. Grace expanded it twice. First the space, then the staff, taking on a young woman named Ada who had come to Willow Creek with her family and had more natural sewing ability than Grace had seen in years. Nathan's reputation grew, extending now into 3 counties, with commissions for buildings that would have seemed beyond reach in the years when he was only the quiet carpenter who fixed things and went home alone. He hired 2 younger men to help on the larger jobs. He built a house for each of them when they married, at cost, because he remembered what it was to be a young man in the valley trying to establish himself. His father died in the winter of 1890, quietly, at home, in the way Thomas Reed had done everything. Without excess drama, having apparently decided that the situation had come to its natural conclusion. Nathan sat with him at the end the same way he had sat with Clara, and this time the grief was different. Still real, still loss, but the kind of loss that has the shape of a complete thing rather than an interrupted one. Thomas Reed had lived a full life and had seen his son, finally, do the same. Nathan and Grace had 2 children. The first was a daughter born in the spring of 1888, who had Grace's directness and Nathan's hands, and from a very early age showed a disturbing tendency to disassemble things to see how they worked. They named her Clara. Grace had suggested the name. Nathan had gone very still when she said it, and Grace had held his gaze and said, "Only if you want to." And Nathan had said, "Yes," without needing more than a moment to know it was right. The second child was a son, born in 1891, who was easier in temperament and who liked to follow Nathan to the workshop and sit on the floor and watch him work with the patient attention of someone who was learning something without being taught. Nathan found him there one afternoon at age 4, sitting very still, watching Nathan's hands on a piece of work, and the sight of it did something to his chest that he didn't try to name. Life was not without difficulty. This is the part that gets left out of stories or compressed into summary, when in fact it is the larger portion of the actual experience. Nathan and Grace argued. They had disagreements about money, about the children, about how Grace ran the shop and how Nathan ran the projects, and about the various minor and occasionally major incompatibilities that exist in any 2 people living close enough to each other to notice them. Grace had a temper she managed mostly, but not always. Nathan had a tendency to go quiet when he should have spoken, to process things inside himself for so long that Grace sometimes had no idea where he was in his head, which frustrated her reliably, and which he worked on with mixed results for the rest of his life. They were not a perfect couple. They were a real one, which is a different and better thing. There were also nights when Nathan lay awake and felt the old fear, not as sharp as it had been, not as paralyzing, but present still. The awareness that the things he loved were things that could be taken. On those nights, he would sometimes lie still and let the fear move through him the way you let a storm move through, knowing it had a far end even when you couldn't see it. And sometimes Grace would wake and find him awake, and not say anything, just put her hand on his arm in the dark, which was enough. That was what he had not understood when he was younger, and grief was new. Enough is not a small thing. Enough is actually the whole of it, the thing that sustains a life across decades rather than just through the dramatic moments. The ordinary, sufficient fact of someone beside you who knows you and stays. Decades later, Nathan sat on the porch. He was 63 years old, which surprised him every time he thought about it directly. And his hands were remarkable, broader even than they had been, more scarred, the knuckles swollen in ways that made the cold mornings difficult, but still competent, still knowing what they were doing when he put them to work. He had slowed down on the larger commissions, but had not stopped entirely, because stopping entirely was not something he could imagine. Grace was beside him, which was where she generally was at the end of a day. She had a piece of mending in her hands. She always had something in her hands. And she was working in the last of the evening light with the particular focused ease of a person doing something so familiar it requires no thought. The garden was in front of them. 30 years of planning had done something to it that no single season could. The kind of depth and density that only comes from accumulated time. layers of roots and returning bulbs and plants that had propagated into small colonies of themselves. It was not neat. It had never been particularly neat, because Grace planted what she liked and then let things go where they went. And Nathan had long since stopped having opinions about the arrangement. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen on a regular basis. He thought this fairly often without saying it, because he was still Nathan Reed, and some things lived better as private knowledge than as stated facts. The hope chest was inside the house, in the bedroom where it had always been since the morning Grace had sat with him and looked at what was in it. Clara, his daughter Clara, now 32 and living in Bozeman with her husband and her 3 children, had asked about it once, when she was old enough to ask the right questions. Nathan had told her the story. All of it, the whole thing, without leaving out the years he had spent in the wrong kind of silence. Clara had listened the same way Grace listened, fully present, without performing her reaction. Then she had said, "Do you think it made you better at this? At our family? Because you already knew what it cost to lose it?" Nathan had thought about that for a long time. "Maybe," he had said. "Or maybe it just made me slower. Maybe I would have gotten here anyway and just gotten here sooner." He had paused. "I don't know that grief makes you better at things. I think it just makes you aware of what's real." His daughter had nodded. She had his hands and her mother's eyes, and the particular quality that both of them had, the ability to be present in a conversation without managing it, and Nathan had looked at her and felt again the thing he had felt watching his son sit on the workshop floor at age 4, that particular undeniable fullness of a life that had been built rather than merely endured. On the porch now, in the evening, he could hear from inside the house the sound of his son's youngest child, a boy of 6, visiting for the week, doing something that sounded like it involved running and at least one piece of furniture. Grace looked up from her mending at the sound, her expression caught briefly between exasperation and amusement, and then settled on amusement. "He's going to break something," she said. "Probably," Nathan agreed. "You should go tell him to settle down." "You could tell him." "He listens to you better." "He listens to the same amount. He just pretends better with me." Grace made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sigh, and went back to her mending. The evening light moved slowly across the garden, catching the late-blooming flowers, making the colors deeper and the shadows longer. Nathan sat with it, all of it, the porch, the garden, the sound of something small and energetic inside the house, the woman beside him with her mending and her 30 years of being exactly who she was without apology. He thought about a carpenter's workshop at 4 in the morning, a letter written to a man in Billings, a road ridden in 2 directions. He thought about a hope chest under a canvas in the corner, and the morning he had finally pulled the canvas off. He thought about a dream that had told him what he had already known and could not quite let himself believe. He had built a great many things in his life. He would, if asked, produce a long and varied list of the work he was proudest of. Technical achievements, structural innovations, furniture that had outlasted its owners and been passed down through families who were still using it. He took an honest pride in the work, which was appropriate. The work was good. But the thing he had built that required the most from him, the thing that had asked for the part of him he had been most afraid to spend, was not made of wood. It was this. The ordinary, difficult, irreplaceable fact of this. He had taken 50 years to understand something that some people figured out early and some people never managed at all, that love was not the thing that made you vulnerable. You were already vulnerable. You were vulnerable the moment you were born into a world that did not make promises. Love was not the exposure. Love was the only honest response to the exposure. It was the thing you built knowing it could be taken, because not building it meant spending your life in an empty room calling the emptiness safety. He had called it safety once. He knew what it actually was. The door banged open and his grandson appeared on the porch at considerable speed, assessed the situation, and redirected himself toward the garden steps with the efficient course correction of a 6-year-old who has decided the outdoors is better than whatever consequence was developing inside. "Don't go past the fence," Nathan said without looking up. The boy stopped, looked at him. "How did you know I was going past the fence?" "I know a lot of things. The boy considered this. Grandma says you know how to build stuff, but you're not very good at feelings. Grace made a sound from beside him. Your grandmother, Nathan said, has a lot of opinions. She has good opinions, the boy said, with the confidence of someone reporting a settled fact, and then he ran into the garden and began doing something complicated near the back flowers that Grace would have thoughts about later. Nathan looked at his wife. Grace was pressing her lips together in the way she did when she found something funny and was not going to admit it directly. Good opinions, Nathan said. Exceptional opinions, Grace corrected, and went back to her mending. The evening came on. The light dropped behind the mountains, the way it did, gradually, and then all at once, and then the first stars. The garden went quiet except for the occasional sound of the boy somewhere in the back of it. Inside the house, the lamp was lit and visible through the parlor window. Nathan sat on the porch of the house he had built for a life that was still here, and he watched the dark come in over the valley, and he was not afraid. He was not fearless. He had never been fearless, and he had stopped mistaking that for a goal. He was something better than fearless. He was a man who had learned the difference between the things fear was warning him about and the things fear was simply costing him, and who had, after considerable difficulty and some damage, and one winter in Billings that he did not revisit without a certain amount of self-reproach, chosen accordingly. The greatest thing Nathan Reed ever built did not stand in any valley or serve any practical function. It could not be assessed for load capacity or admired for the precision of its joinery. It would not outlast him in the way the barns and houses and furniture would outlast him. But it had made every other thing he built